Hi everyone, we're coming back to New Zealand again. Those who are following this podcast know that I'm all over the place, including all over the world, but we're back to New Zealand and I'm very pleased to bring onto the show Dr Oliver Hartwich. He's the Executive Director at the New Zealand Initiative. Oliver, lovely to have you on the show.
Oh, great to be with you, Simon.
Hey, first and foremost, can I just say thank you for the work of the initiative? I know people who follow this podcast, there'll be people on the left and the right, but you guys just put out really thought-provoking research. In fact, to throw you quickly, give people a quick introduction to actually what the New Zealand Initiative is. They should know because we've had Roger Partridge on before and others, James Kerstead. But just quickly, tell us about the initiative and then we'll get into this whole question of housing and particularly housing for our older people.
Sure. The New Zealand Initiative is a think tank. That is an organization that thinks deeply about policy issues affecting New Zealand and actually shaping our future. We are also a business membership organization, so we're supported by a broad range of companies from different industries. So we've got banks and supermarkets, professional services firms, law firms, and everything in between, logistics companies. And the idea is not to work as a lobby group. So we're not really primarily working for our members, but the members come together in a philanthropic way. They want to support us developing policies that will make New Zealand a much better place in the future, whether that is on housing issues and housing affordability, whether it's about education and making sure that every child in New Zealand gets a decent education, whether it is making us a more attractive place for foreign investors, because that will create economic opportunity, or whether it is indeed anything else that will improve the quality of life for ordinary New Zealanders. That is what we're working on. We're proposing our policies through reports, we're commenting in the media, and every now and then I'm on a podcast like yours.
Yeah, but, look, I'm always grateful actually of just how open you guys are to come and talk on a wide range of topics. And as I say, there'll be people who go, oh, I might not agree. And you go, well, that's fine. But the initiative has put out really good research. And I've always found it challenging in the best way. So thank you for that. We were saying just before we started the podcast that you're celebrating did you say 20th year of being in think tanks? And you started around the issue of housing affordability, which is obviously what we're going to talk into here. Tell us a little bit about, where this all started for you.
Well, it all started 20 years ago in London. I had my first job in think tank land with a conservative think tank called Policy Exchange, which is now probably the largest centre-right think tank in London. At the time, it was a startup. So we were 5 people in a small office in Westminster, just opposite the QE2 conference centre, stone throw from Westminster Abbey. They hired me onto a project on housing affordability, and I was lucky enough to work with a professor of urban economics, the late Alan Evans from the University of Reading, and we produced a series of 3 reports on housing affordability. And that was really my start into think tank land and also my start into housing policy, because originally I'd never worked on housing policy before. My PhD is actually in competition economics. But it was quite a formative time for me because I learned how think tanks work and I developed a very long, I would say now lifelong passion for housing policy.
And that's therefore a great place to start. As I say, for viewers and listeners, we're going to talk around particularly aged care and what's happening there. Oliver, you've done some great interviews of late, and I know podcasts around this. But let's start broad. New Zealanders talk about having a housing problem. Doesn't matter if you're trying to find a rental, trying to buy your first house. It's a common conversation. You obviously have researched this far more deeply. I mean, it's a simplistic question to start with, but is it right? People's perceptions. Do we have a housing problem in this country?
Yes, absolutely. And you can measure that. So once upon a time, you talk about 3 times your annual household income to buy the average or the median house. Nowadays, depending on where you live, of course, it can cost you 8 times or 10 times your household income from a year to buy an average house. So obviously, something has gone wrong and we've lost housing affordability. That said, it is not just a New Zealand issue, of course. I mentioned I started my think tank career in London. It was exactly the same issue there. I lived in Australia as well and found the problems replicated in Australia. So we've got a global problem with housing affordability. And the root causes of that housing affordability problem are the same in all of these English-speaking countries. And if you're interested, we can talk them through.
Yep. No, please do, because I mean, I think I've just come from actually another meeting on a whole different topic, but one of the themes with the gentleman was New Zealand often thinks it's exceptional. And we are at one level of that word, but at another, what we experience is not unique to us. And you've said housing is a problem around the globe. I mean, are you saying it's everywhere, or is this particularly in the Western world?
Well, it is not everywhere because some countries are better than others, but it is certainly a widespread problem, especially in the English-speaking developed world. So whether you go to Britain or Ireland or Australia or indeed New Zealand, you will find the same problems. And they have a common root cause. One cause is actually the planning system, the British derived planning system, which started in the 1930s and 40s, came out of a very utopian socialist dream that the planners actually designed in Britain. People like Sir Patrick Abercrombie, the great architect behind the plan for London in the 1930s and 40s. And out of that came the British Town and Country Planning Act, 1947, which then influenced planning legislation around the world, including our own, all the way down to the Resource Management Act. So this very restrictive approach to town planning, where we limit the release of land, is one of the root causes of a housing affordability crisis. But there's a second one, and that's probably equally important. In all these countries, we also find that local government is typically not incentivized to go for development. Now, let me explain that a little bit what it means. When you look at Britain, for example, in Britain, councils get about 3/4 of their budgets from central government, no matter what happens in their areas, no matter whether they're going for development or not. Now, when it comes to development, you're asking the same councils to please provide the infrastructure, build the roads, lay the pipes, organize the rubbish collection, and then deal with the neighbors who are usually not very happy when somebody moves into the neighborhood because it adds pressure to public services and it adds a bit more congestion. So what happens then is the whole thing gets done. It costs local government a lot of money, but all the upsides, the extra VAT in Britain, our version would be GST, the extra income taxes, the extra corporate taxes, they go to the national government, in this case in London, in our case in Wellington. And so we've got this disconnect between councils paying for development just to make it happen and national governments then receiving the upsides, the benefits from that development. And that's a recipe for disaster because it means that the two tiers of government, both in charge of development, don't see eye to eye. And this is what's stalling housing development.
Starting on that one, I know from my time in Wellington, there was always great tension between the central and the local government. And one of many frustrations which local government used to voice to me was that Wellington makes all these rules, yet they have to pay for it. So as you say, was it 900 plus pages in the RMA? But take something as simple as water. The government keeps passing rules and the councils then have to go and find the money. And I mean, there's some councils here in New Zealand at the moment, Oliver, that just effectively can't afford to do the upgrades that are imposed on them. So, I mean, what would be then some of the solutions? Is it that a taxation approach? Should there be more like a city tax, for example? I'm not articulating this very well. You're the expert. What are some of the solutions?
The solution, as in so many other cases, is to be a bit more Swiss, because the Swiss are actually doing it a lot better than us. In Switzerland, you have a very decentralized system of government. So just to put some numbers to that, in Switzerland, we're talking about a country that is the size of Canterbury, so geographically very small. Population in Switzerland is about 9 million people, and they have how many councils? Do you have an idea?
You put me on the spot. I'd have no idea. There we go. I'm admitting my ignorance.
No, okay. I mean, New Zealand has got 78 councils, and Switzerland has 2,000.
2,000?
2,000 councils, plus 26 cantons. And here comes the really interesting bit. Each council and each canton in Switzerland levies its own income tax. They can set their own income tax rates. So effectively, you've got more than 2,000 income tax systems in Switzerland in a place geographically the size of Canterbury. Now, from the outside, you might say, this sounds like madness. Who would do that? But actually, it works really well because first of all, you've got competition between councils. They want to keep you there because otherwise you move 3 kilometers down the road and you pay your tax elsewhere. So they are really nice to you. They're treating you like a customer. And also what it means is when a council grows, when it creates more development, when it builds houses or actually creates new business opportunities, they keep the taxes. So the taxes stay where the development is. It actually pays for the infrastructure required to make the development happen. And therefore, in the long run, they keep house prices stable. So Switzerland, despite having very serious inward migration, a bit like New Zealand, has only experienced about 1/10 of our house price inflation. And that is because the market is more flexible because councils are actually seeing the upside of development and they're making it happen.
exceptionally counterintuitive to me. As you say, it was at 26 cantons, 2,000 or so councils. And here in New Zealand, of course, we're all about trying to merge them to have even fewer councils. Again, quite counterintuitive, but if it's
Totally.
working,
Yep, and that was actually part of the project I did 20 years ago. So when we started the project in London, I said to my colleagues, and I was new to London, I had only been there for less than a year. Coming from Germany, I said to my colleagues, very interesting what you're trying to do with planning simplification, but I tell you, I come from Germany. We've got planning rules too. And yet I've never seen this kind of house price excess that you have in Britain. There must be another reason. And then I begged my colleagues to give me a travel grant so I could travel to Germany and Switzerland because these were the outliers really for house prices. I was trying to figure out why were they so stable over such long periods of time. And I also traveled to Ireland and Australia because they were just like Britain. So I just wanted to compare on the ground. And when I visited Switzerland, that was an eye-opening experience. And that actually started a lifelong fascination with Switzerland for me. And over the years, I've become an absolute fan of everything Swiss. I think they do so many things so much better than us. And I mean, I'm talking to you as a conservative. I mean, every conservative deep down wants to be a bit more Swiss, right?
all
So
right.
it's a bit of a conservative dreamland. And so I'm a great believer in looking at Switzerland, learning from Switzerland, because we could do so many things so much better, whether it is tourism development, economic development, housing affordability, social care. And that's why we took our members actually to Switzerland in 2017, traveled around the place just to be inspired. And by the way, Christopher Luxon was part of that group when he was still there in New Zealand. And we learned so much. And I think if we applied the lessons here, New Zealand would be an infinitely better country.
Do you think? Sadly, I've only been to Zurich for. No, sorry, it was lovely to go to Zurich, but sadly, I've only been there for 2 days. But I must say, I just loved it. Things seem to work and function
Yep.
wonderfully well. But I mean, why is it that we don't take these lessons then? I mean,
Well,
obviously, people. Yeah, you said you've taken a delegation. Our now prime minister's been there. There's copious
yes,
reports. People like you speak to this. What is there a reluctance in New Zealand? Do you think to adapt new ideas from others?
a little bit of that. I think there is a deeper reason. When it comes to comparing New Zealand to other countries, well, first of all, we say we're an island, we're different, we're unique. Whereas I think, well, actually, most public policy problems New Zealand has exist in other countries as well. I mean, every country wants better infrastructure and more teachers and better healthcare. We're not unique in that sense. So the chances that the solutions are out there are relatively high. We don't have to reinvent the wheel in New Zealand for public policy questions most of the time. But the other thing is when it comes to comparing ourselves then, I mean, who do we look to? We look at Australia because obviously they're quite similar and they're relatively close by. We might look at Britain because that's kind of where everything is derived from. So, of course, we compare with Britain. Every now and then, we might look at the United States. We might look at Canada because they're also a little bit like us. And beyond that, we basically stop comparing because these other countries, they look so different. They have nothing much in common, we think. Then they speak these weird languages. I mean, they speak German in Switzerland or French or Italian. We don't go to these places and we don't bother actually trying to figure out how these other countries work. And I thought we should do that. We should actually go to places that don't speak our language, that we don't know much about, and compare. So we at the initiative are great fans of comparative research, of traveling around the world. And with our members, we have now visited Switzerland in 2017. We visited Denmark and spent a day in Sweden in 2019. We went to Ireland in 2023. Well, you could argue that they speak some sort of English. And we are about to go to the Netherlands in June this year. And we're taking 43 people, mainly large company business chief execs and chairs with us. And we take them there because I am sure that, okay, we all know where the Netherlands are, but we don't know too much about it in detail. And we want to take them there to be inspired, to see how they do things. And then we want to figure out what can we take with us? What can we take home? What can we implement here?
Again, says me. I think that's great. I said, I think I love this country. We do things well in some places, but I'm stunned at times. And you mentioned the phrase "reinvent the wheel." We often seem to want to reinvent the wheel. Doesn't matter if it's in housing that we're discussing at the moment, or education certainly comes to mind, or health. And I'm going, there's plenty of examples around the world that, in a sense, we could just take off the shelf. But there does seem to be a reluctance. But jumping back
Yes.
to your councils, that they can tax their own. I mean, one of the little theories I've had, and please feel free to shoot it down, that by paying rates in New Zealand, among other problems, it's only the homeowners that, in a sense, become invested in their local community to that depth. Anyone else who rents or doesn't contribute, and I'm being a bit crude here for the sake of simplicity, but the interest in the roads and the footpaths and becomes secondary because you're not paying for them. I mean, is that part of an argument we should actually scrap rates and go to sort of an income tax that the cities can charge, or do you think it's going to be too hard to swallow for central government?
Well, it might well be too hard to swallow, but it would be worthwhile. You're right. I mean, if you're not a ratepayer yourself, you wouldn't even see how much you pay. Because, of course, even if you're a tenant, you pay just indirectly. Because, of course, your landlord doesn't pay the tax for you, you just passes it on. But the other thing is actually what we have here is we have effectively a land tax system with our rates. And okay, land taxes have some beautiful features from an economics perspective because you can levy them quite easily. And land doesn't run away. You can't just hide it. It's just there and it's easy to tax. So I get it from an economic perspective that land taxes are quite attractive sometimes. That said, there are some drawbacks. And I just want to give you a very practical example. I'm in Wellington. We own a house in Wellington. And if I, for some inexplicable reasons, was unhappy with Wellington City Council, I mean, why would I? But I couldn't just leave and say move to Porirua or Upper Hutt, buy a house there and punish Wellington City Council in that way because somebody else would pay my rate. They would buy my house, they would pay exactly the same rate, and Wellington City Council wouldn't feel it at all that I was unhappy and left. Because in the end, the land is still there and you tax it and your budget doesn't change by a single cent. In Switzerland, of course, this would be different. In Switzerland, I would say to the council, hey, I'm really unhappy with how you're doing things and I don't feel treated like a customer. And you know what? I'm off. I move down the road and I pay my tax to the next council. And in Switzerland's case, okay, somebody would buy the house, but whether they have got the same income as I do is a different matter. So they would definitely lose a part of my income tax. And I think that would punish them. And therefore, Swiss councils are much nicer to their people. They want to keep them there. They treat them as customers. I mean, it's a very strange kind of concept by New Zealand standards to expect a council to treat you as a customer to make sure you're happy. But the Swiss do that, and it works.
Well, it's leverage, isn't it? You've got leverage as someone who's paying in, and you're right. I hadn't even thought about that. Your ability to move are still getting past the fact, Oliver, that there's 2,000 plus councils. But yeah, you can see how the leverage affects things. You mentioned Germany as well. Obviously, that's originally home for you, but you mentioned it as another area initially. I think seemed to have housing.
Yeah.
Is that still the case, or is Germany slipping a little bit? Is it one that we should still be looking at?
Well, Germany has slipped a little bit in the last decade. That's mainly after the GFC when interest rates were so low and the European Central Bank tried to stimulate the European economy. Of course, that created a lot of money. The money flooded into the housing market and pushed up prices. But if you look long term, I mean, when we did our research in 2005, we had data going back to 1970. And over the 33 years, from 1970 to 2003 at the time, German house prices had remained stagnant in real terms. Meaning, if you took the ordinary rate of inflation away, you could buy a house in Germany for the same price you would have paid 33 years earlier. And okay, 20 years have passed since, and they've had a little bit of house price inflation, but still, overall, I mean, this is just a little bit of an upward trend. Nothing like the house price inflation we've had in New Zealand or Australia or Ireland or Britain. They're still relatively affordable in Germany. And the reason is exactly the same as in Switzerland's case. Councils actually keep some of the uplift, really, when it comes to development. They keep some of the taxes generated out of that, and therefore they are much more willing to build.
Which makes sense. I mean, what do you say? It's a slight tangent because I want to come back to the British planning and the Utopia comment, but what do you say to people who argue in New Zealand that there's effectively now a landed class, the boomers, for want of a better term, to somewhat quote Chloe Swarbrick, that they're enjoying having expensive, high prices, and therefore don't want to see any of the structures or the system change. Do you see any of that motive in play here in New Zealand amongst all the other challenges we have?
Well, at the risk of agreeing with Chloe Swarbrick this once, yes, there is an element of that. Because once you have seen your house price inflate, of course, you kind of treat this as your property now and you don't want to see any of this gone again. So yes, I mean, you create your own constituency for high house prices. And actually reminds me of the time when we started our research at the initiative. John Key was challenged on breakfast TV once about Auckland house prices and what he's going to do about it. And isn't it a big catastrophe and a housing affordability crisis? And John Key brushed it all off and said, you know what? Whenever I go to Auckland, people are really happy about their house prices and they tell me how much money they made out of the property market. And it's a good thing when house prices go up. And at the time, I thought, well, this is such a ridiculous comment, really, because basically what you've done is you've introduced socialism, you've artificially jacked up the price of houses, and then afterwards you say it's a wonderful thing and it's created wealth. Well, if that works so well, why don't we introduce a vehicle management act, like the resource management act, but for cars, where we say you can't import cars, you can't repair cars, and then you would see what happens to the value of your car. And you can all feel richer on the back of that because we have completely deregulated the market out of existence. And then you can probably at some stage even take a mortgage against the value of your car and feel rich about yourself and finance your consumption. You see, I mean, this is a satire, of course.
It is,
But
still.
just because house prices go up doesn't mean the country gets richer. I mean, by the way, if you want to find that, you look at The Wealth of Nations, written by Adam Smith in 1776, where he already writes that a nation cannot get richer just because asset prices go up like that, because it doesn't create any wealth. So, no, we have to tackle this head on. There are many people who feel rich because of their house prices, but it doesn't actually make the country rich if it's all just inflated values.
Which I think is an incredibly important thing for people to get in their mind, because often, as you noted, people go, hey, I've got all this money supposedly in my property value. It doesn't make, as you say, the country richer. And I think it's fundamentally important. Jumping back, you mentioned at the start that obviously we've inherited a lot of our sort of planning perspectives and rules from the United Kingdom. And one phrase caught my attention in particular. You said it was based sort of on a utopianism. Could you just sort of tease that out a bit? What did these planners think back then? What were they trying to create by developing the system that we have inherited today?
Okay, so basically, if you look at 1930s, 1940s Britain, or actually even wider Europe, this was the high time of collectivist planning and socialist ideas. People were looking at the Soviet Union as a relatively new experiment. They were wondering, even economists were wondering, whether there was something to be learned from the Soviets. Then, of course, it was the beginning of Keynesianism. You know, John Maynard Keynes published his general theory. And these were the ideas shaping intellectual life, certainly in Britain. And perhaps to make it a bit of a history lesson here, Britain, of course, won the war in 45. And it was the result of a collective effort. So the whole country pulled together and defeated evil Nazi Germany. You would have thought then that the great winner of the war, Winston Churchill, would have been returned as prime minister, but didn't happen. Of course, he was kicked out just a month later in a general election, and Clement Attlee came in from the Labour Party and became a Labour prime minister, introducing basically the whole of the British welfare state. Why did that happen? Well, because the argument the Labour Party used in the 1945 election in Britain was, we have won the war with a collective effort, and now we're again going to win the peace. We're doing it exactly the same way with a collective effort. And so they nationalized huge parts of the economy, they regulated everything, they created the National Health Service, they started the welfare state, and they tried to do this in a collective way, in basically a socialist way. And that, of course, didn't work well. It didn't end well. I mean, by the 1970s, Britain had to be bailed out by the IMF. In 1979, they had the winter of discontent, and then Margaret Thatcher came and had to clean up the whole mess. By the way, the Germans did it differently. In Germany, the result of the Second World War was the complete opposite, of course. Germany was humiliated, it had lost the war. Nobody believed in the wonderful role of the state anymore after the evil Nazi dictatorship. And so in 1945, they tried something different. They believed in themselves, in individuals, in freedom, in property rights, in markets. And they had an economics minister in Ludwig Erhard who stood for all of that, later became chancellor as well. And they tried the social market economy. And by 1969, West Germany overtook Britain in GDP per capita. So the loser of the war, because it shows the right economic philosophy, actually overtook the winner of the war in 69. I mean, that is actually the kind of history lesson that we now and then have to revisit, because we are often in the process, or in the temptation really, of repeating these old mistakes.
One of the themes coming through here is really the need for New Zealand to compare itself, or to look abroad and see what is and is not happening, where it is working. So you've mentioned Germany, obviously, Switzerland as well, and then the corollary, when, like of the UK, it's not working well. I mean, if we return then to New Zealand, I mean, we've touched on this before, not in this conversation, but you mentioned the RMA. We're talking planning rules. I mean, having bought, sold, and built houses here, it's very difficult. It's incredibly costly. You've spent tens of thousands before you've even started because you've got to get consents and building and resort. It's just, is the system here practically broken as well?
Yes, I would say we have an enormous amount of bureaucracy. We have an enormous amount of rules you have to follow when you build stuff. I mean, I've just recently gone through it myself. We have a spa pool that needed a fence. Need I say more? We have become quite a bureaucratic country. It shouldn't be that hard. It wasn't always that hard. Fortunately, we've got a government now that's actually doing stuff about it. So we're getting a new RMA, or actually separate acts now replacing the RMA. And the idea from people like Chris Bishop and Simon Court is actually to make this a property rights-centered planning law, which is, of course, revolutionary for New Zealand and would fix a lot of our problems. But yes, and in many ways, we have just made it too hard for ourselves.
Yeah, I found it, I mean, in my political career, the RMA or people trying to get through the system was incredibly frustrating. Also, my wife, she's a Kiwi but lived in America, and granted it's a much larger country, but she would talk about building houses there where you just go down to effectively a Walmart and you buy your doors and your windows, they're set sizes, cheap, many options, whereas here everything's almost custom made, almost feels to me monopolistic at times in terms of certain products, and we just pay enormous amounts per square meter. I mean, are these things which should be quickly addressed? I mean, this is as much a political point, but are these things that can be addressed, and can they be addressed quickly and easily?
Yeah, of course they can be addressed. I mean, if you indulge me, I'll tell you the story of my fence, which is a perfect example. So when we bought the house in 2012, there was a spa pool already at the house, but it was empty. And we asked, so why is it empty? Oh, because the previous owners never bothered to build a fence, so it was never legal. I thought, well, in which case we'll build a fence. So we engaged a company building a fence for us, and they also cooperated with the council. The council came, basically looked at it and gave us approval, and then we used the fence legally and a pool for 12 years, we thought. Until a council inspector came along last year and said, did you ever get building permission for this fence and resource consents? What? You approved it. You kept approving it for 12 years. And I said, but you should have actually had a consent. Then I checked, and fences don't actually require approval if they're under 2 meters. And this fence is definitely under 2 meters, except for when they are the boundary to a pool. Well, in which case we need approval. Then the law was changed in 2014, I found, so spa pools no longer need fences if they have a lockable cover, which ours has. Except ours was about 10 centimeters too close to the neighbor's property, in which case that rule doesn't apply. And so now we had to go through the whole process of getting retrospective permission for something that the council had ticked off every couple of years for 12 years. And we needed an engineering report, the council needed to come out, they need to do the testing, they needed to do all sorts of things. By the end of it, and please don't tell my wife, this would have cost us, by my estimate, around $12,000 to get this stupid fence retrospectively approved. And the end result is that the fence still stands and nothing has changed. It has just cost us about 8 months, several council leanings, engineering reports, and you wouldn't believe what we had to go through just to have exactly the same result as before. And you're telling me that this country couldn't deregulate? Of course we could. I mean, this is just one example. Talk to any of our companies operating in New Zealand, and they can tell you way worse stories. I mean, this is just a tiny little story from suburban Wellington. But we have real problems when it comes to building anything, whether it's a new factory, a new office building, a new subdevelopment, or indeed any kind of project. And that is before we even get to international investment. If you try to get international investors into New Zealand, the kind of hoops and hurdles they have to jump through, it is crazy. So if we want to develop, we have to get rid of all of this nonsense, because then we can finally grow again.
I'm not going to bore you, but my wife and I have had similar issues around our pool and spas. Fortunately, not quite to that dramatic level, but I'll just say this. Is it 2 or 3 years, the inspector comes around, and there's always something different. And more recently, and again, for me, it's illustrative of what you just shared. The pool's been there for 15 or so years, and all of a sudden, the last inspection, there was a whole different perspective, which cost me a small fortune, not quite as bad as as yours, and my wife knows about it. But I suppose they're good illustrations of how that wider system's broken and why people end up paying. Well, ultimately, it's the buyer that pays, isn't it? Because of all these rules, RMA, all the consultation, it's one of the key reasons why, let's say, the first home buyer is really struggling to get on the ladder. Amongst
Exactly. And for
too.
what gain? Because in the end, your pool probably stayed exactly the same as ours, but we would have spent quite a small fortune just keeping it like that. That is not how countries get rich. We want to make sure that when we actually build something, we get something for our money, because otherwise it's pointless.
Well, the other illustration, and this is probably more in the renting space, and look, it reflects my politics, but we had all these healthy homes rules come in, and all of a sudden we needed more drainage, more things around windows, more heaters. And, on a conceptual, if I wanted to say, Oliver, on a moral level, making a home more comfortable and better, that's great. But at an economic level, that's extra cost.
Well, actually, I can give you another example. I mean, just to show the absurdity of the whole thing, this spa pool is, of course, outside. But in order to get the retrospective building permission, we had to exchange our inside fire detectors, because there is a new rule introduced by MB last year that all fire detectors now need to be wirelessly connected with each other, so that when one fire smoke alarm goes off, the other ones go off automatically. So all the existing ones, because we had smoke alarms, had to be ripped out and replaced by new ones in order to get a retrospective building permission for something that wasn't even in the house but outside. I mean, how crazy is that?
I won't go into too much detail. It's a friend of mine that, long and short, it cost them millions. They had an issue outside. I think it was to do with the balconies is where it started. But as the council came in to give the consent for that, everything else came up for grabs. It was, I've forgotten what the right term is, and you might have it, but they basically look at your house in the current eyes and go, oh, well, it's nice you got this fireplace, those fire alarms, this, and this. The amount of changes, millions and millions of dollars, quite a big house, but it was just nuts. So in a strange way, a lot of people, if they know about this dynamic, won't even bother doing things to their houses, or they'll just do it and not tell the council. I mean, these are perverse incentives.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I mentioned the example. I mean, I don't want people to feel pity for me or anything, but it's just a kind of in a nutshell, that's what's wrong with the country. Why do we need permission for everything like that? Other countries are probably better able to deal with it. And again, if that had happened in Switzerland, I think the council would have probably been a bit more accommodating, because in the end, you are their customer. They want to keep you happy. So here, of course, what incentive would any council have to be nice to you? Because in the end, even if I sold my house, they would still get my rate.
Yeah, it's said that the structures are set wrong. I wonder too, at times, we're a bit like frogs being boiled in hot water. We just have got used to it all. And again, it's probably a good incentive not only to engage think tanks like your own, but for Kiwis to travel more and actually see what is happening.
Can I give you another example
Please.
on that? So when we traveled to Ireland in 23, we spent a lot of time dealing with foreign direct investment, because Ireland, once upon a time, was about 25% poorer than New Zealand. When we're talking about the late 1970s, by the early 1990s, we had about the same GDP per capita, and now they are, by some measures, probably twice as rich as us. We wanted to figure out how that happened. And we looked especially at foreign direct investment, because the Irish made a very deliberate choice, to open their economy to international capital, welcome companies to set up shop in Ireland, and out of that they became rich. We had a meeting with the Irish economics minister, Simon Coveney, at the time, and what really impressed me was he said he couldn't travel around his country, not even to the smallest village, without being challenged by the locals. Hey, minister, what can you do to get us some foreign direct investment here? Because we've seen what wonders it does in the neighboring counties. So he said actually foreign direct investment was a very positive thing, and everybody in Ireland wanted to have a piece of the action. In New Zealand, foreign direct investment, it's really dangerous. Do we want these foreigners here? And we become tenants in our own country, and it's really hard. And who knows, they might take the land away. I mean, they won't. But anyway, in Ireland, the narrative was different. So they were actually embracing it because they had seen what positive things it had brought to Ireland, including creating 150,000 jobs. And once you've seen it actually, how it works in Ireland, we visited the Intel factory on the outskirts of Dublin. In that single factory, since 1989, when Intel set up shop in Ireland, they invested a total of more than 53 billion New Zealand dollars in a single factory. We haven't got anything like that in New Zealand. So we are missing out if we are so kind of careful and cautious and really skeptical of foreign direct investment. And we are doing this to ourselves. I mean, if we changed our attitude a bit and if we became a bit more welcoming to international investors like Intel, you would not recognize the country anymore. It would be a completely changed place with a lot more opportunity, a lot more prosperity. And really, then we would have the tax revenue that we could use to do all sorts of things that currently we can only dream of.
Is it partly that, I can take some of the blame myself to a degree, that the political class or the politicians aren't actually explaining the opportunities well enough to New Zealand? As you say, New Zealanders, we get very nervous when we talk about foreign investment. We sort of feel we're going to have our lives interfered with. I mean, are we just not selling the story well?
Yes, I think that's part of the problem. When it comes to New Zealand, we think of foreign investment basically in terms of land, of agriculture, and then we think of maybe some Chinese companies buying some farms. I mean, often forgetting the fact that these are underperforming farms that work better afterwards. And of course, you can't take the land out of New Zealand. They're still there physically. Whereas in Ireland, they tend to think of foreign investment in different categories. The foreign direct investment in Ireland is Intel building a chip factory in Dublin. It is a cluster of pharmaceutical companies around Galway, for example, that we also visited. And so they actually see much more positive, concrete results in other fields outside agriculture, and therefore the story is a different one. We would have every opportunity to recreate that story here, but we don't.
I was actually just in Ireland a few months ago as a tourist, but went past that Intel factory outside of Dublin, and it is massive. And
Yep.
if footprint is any indication, that's hundreds, if not thousands, of jobs. And I think this is one of the ironies in New Zealand for me, Oliver, that we look at other countries' wealth, their ability to, let's say, buy more pharmaceuticals or have more domestic spending, and yet we are not making the changes in the background to allow that to happen. So again, I suppose that's the encouragement for people. Go and travel. Go and travel. Or if you can't, you can read the New Zealand Initiative reports. Hey, narrowing into the aged care sector, because I know this will be of interest to some of our people, and something I'm with at the moment in terms of family. We seem to have a bit of a problem in the aged care sector as well. And in particular, you were doing a talk recently and some work and commentary. That long and short, there's a bit of a crisis coming down the pipeline because we're not building enough aged care facilities. The cost is prohibitive. Just talk us a bit through what you've heard and seen in that area.
Okay, so the story started actually with us publishing a report on primary health care. So we released a report written by a GP, Dr. Prabhani Wood. The report's called The Heart of Healthcare. You can find it on our website if you're interested. And Prabhani wrote about her work as a GP and her experiences as a GP. And one of the things that she describes is actually the importance of continuity of care. The idea that you keep seeing the same GP over long periods of time, so you get to know the GP, you trust the GP, and vice versa, of course, the GP gets to know you. And if you do that regularly, there is good evidence that you are leading a healthier life because any kind of problems that might come along, the GP would detect them and they would deal with them before it actually becomes something that you can only deal with by going to hospital. And so that was the basic thesis of Prabhani's report. And when we launched it, one of our members, Scott Sculler, the CEO of Somerset, came to me and said, well, great report, I read it, and you know what, we've got exactly the same issue in old age care. Because we have continuity of care. Somerset is actually an organization that provides the whole range of medical services from GP to hospital grade care. And he says, we see exactly the same because we know our residents, they know us, and we can actually provide them with the services they need along the way. Unfortunately, he then told me, the problem is that we are not equipped really to do this properly with an aging population because we can't even add beds soon enough before we actually have this aging. And by his estimate, will probably be about 10,000 old age care beds short by 2030, which is only 5 years away, of course. And then he
10,000
explained,
short in the next 4.5, 5.
yes.
Oh.
And the additional problem is old age care costs you about $180 a night.
Mm-hmm.
So it's relatively affordable, certainly more affordable than hospital grade care, because once you turn up at A&E and stay in hospital, you easily talk about more than $1,000 a night. So you can imagine what happens if we haven't got the beds in old age care, because these patients will then turn up at the nearest hospital and present themselves. And therefore, they will actually shift the cost to the public health system. And well, Scott Sculler warns that in the end, we will cripple our public hospital system because of all the patients that couldn't actually be taken care of by old age care providers like Somerset. So we had a good discussion about it. The really frustrating bit there was I picked up from how he told the story that he finds it difficult to even engage with the right people, whether it is the bureaucrats working in Health New Zealand or even trying to figure out who is the best minister to talk to, because he somehow falls through the cracks. I mean, there's a minister for the elderly, and that's currently Casey Costello. Then we've got a health minister, of course, and Simeon Brown. And you've got all sorts of other ministers and associate ministers. And there is no one here really taking responsibility of that particular problem. And because nobody is addressing it, he thinks this will spiral out of control and will come to bite us.
I'd like to come back actually to the number of ministers. It's something that bothered me almost from the day I went into politics and still there. But it sounds like, well, a major crisis coming, if they can't build enough, and I assume the likes of Somerset or Ryman, Bupa, Oceania, they'll all be running into the same planning problems that we were talking about earlier around housing. If you and I are struggling to get our pools fenced, they're going to find it immensely difficult to build what's required. It sounds like, well, part of the problem, maybe I should phrase it this way because I've got multiple thoughts. This is ultimately going to mean if we are short, you said 10,000 short they anticipate, that's 10,000 beds in our public health service. And obviously our health system, and we could speak for hours on this, is in trouble. Government's trying to address, or governments try to address it. But do you think that we just got our head in the sand? Maybe that's what I'm trying to get to. I mean, if it's squeezing the balloon, if we can't fill, or rather if the likes of Somerset and Oceania can't sate the supply or the demand, got to get it all mixed up, is going to pop out elsewhere, and our system's already struggling. This should be a major red flag.
I believe it is a red flag, and I wouldn't blame anyone, least of all Simeon Brown. I'm a huge fan of Simeon Brown's. I think he's one of our most capable ministers. But I mean, literally, it's a hospital pass having the health portfolio, because the system is in such a crisis right now after really decades of, what should we call it, neglect. It wasn't really neglect. I mean, it was dealt with, but it was basically reorganized. They were really shuffling the deck chairs or changing the structures, to DHBs and then abolishing the DHBs again, now centralizing everything, then realizing the centralization didn't work and now thinking about how do we decentralize it again. So we've basically tried to deal with healthcare in a way by, just changing the administrative structures every few years without ever really fundamentally addressing the main problems of the sector. So that is a problem. And I don't envy Simeon Brown at all. I think he's got the toughest job in government, or one of the toughest jobs. But I think it also takes a bit of a bigger debate, the public debate. I think the public hasn't woken up to the demographic challenges that we face. This country is aging. We are still relatively young by international standards. I mean, our median age last time I checked was probably around 38. That means half the population is under 38, the other half is above 38. If you look at Italy, Germany, Japan, they are already around 50 median age. That means they are much older as a society compared to us. But then again, in these countries, in Japan, in Germany, in Italy, we can see our future because we will get there. And we know what this means now because we can actually just check how the other countries had to deal with it, how much healthcare needs that created, how many old age care beds they needed. And when we look at that and compare where we currently stand, we see we've got a massive shortfall. We are not prepared. And as I said, we need a debate because currently, although we kind of all have it in the back of our heads, there's something happening there. Few people would be aware of the precise numbers and the real challenges that are coming our way.
I think part of it's only my reflection. Part of it is, and I can say this having been a former politician, is that we just confront what's immediately in front of us, which is a bit of a problem. And I use that as a reason and not an excuse. But it's easier to confront the immediate problems. I mean, we should all know what's coming down the pipeline. So we've all seen the demographic trends. And again, I'm quite alarmed, actually. I hadn't picked up the numbers from some of my earlier reading of yours, that 10,000 beds short in sort of 4.5, 5 years. I suppose part of that too, you speak about aging. If people are, and I'm thinking of my own folks here and in-laws, that they're staying in their homes longer. Is that going to have an effect too? That not wishing people to die earlier, but if people are staying in the existing homes longer and there isn't the likes of aged care, it's going to make it even harder for new people, if you will, to get into the property market. I mean, or am I overthinking this?
No, that's part of the problem. But then again, of course, what do you want to do about it? I mean, you wouldn't want to legislate people to leave their homes.
No,
Um,
no, I'm on the right of politics. We're not doing
exactly.
that.
So I think no, we have to. I mean, it is a problem, of course, contributing to a housing crisis, but it's one that you couldn't really address in a policy way. I think the best way is just to build more houses.
And that then comes back to obviously reducing the red tape, fixing up the likes of the RMA,
Exactly.
building supplies, and so forth. I mean, last sort of set of thoughts, because it was around, you mentioned the ministers, and I know I even been in the system working out which minister to talk to. You guys have also done some research to, if I was to summarize it, and you'll do a much better job, is basically there's far too many ministers, too many associate ministers, too many ministries, too many bureaucrats. I mean, would be fair?
Yeah, I can tell you actually how all of that happened. During the coalition talks in 23, I picked up from one of the coalition parties, I won't say which one, that they wanted to create another 5 portfolios. And I thought, you must be kidding. Do you know how many portfolios we have? And at the time, I looked it up and I wrote a column about it, quite an angry one, for the Australian. We had 78 portfolios. And I thought, it's just madness to want to create even more on top of that. And then we had a young researcher working for us here at the time, looking for his next project, Max Salmon. And I said to Max, you know what? I've got an idea for you. You write a paper and you explain how did we even get to that point? How many portfolios did we have? How many ministers did we have? What were the factors driving us towards it? So Max wrote a really good report on that. At the end of that, I said to Max, you know what? Wonderful report, but of course nobody's going to read it. But if you have an infographic, you've got a chance. So is there any way in which you can present your findings in an infographic? So he contacted a designer and we came up with a spaghetti diagram. I think that's how we call it internally. And I just want to talk you through. I mean, it would be nice actually if you could include this somewhere in your show notes.
I'll see if I can. As you talk, I'll see if I can find it.
Okay, I'll tell you what the report's called. The report is called Cabinet Congestion. The Growth of a Ministerial Maze by Max Salmon. And if you Google it, you can find the spaghetti diagram on our website. So basically, we have got areas of the economy or areas of the country, like health, like education, like defense, like environment. Then we split them into 42 different ministries, departments, and agencies. 42. Then we split them into currently, because we've had a cabinet reshuffle, 82 different portfolios, and then we let them be served by 28 people, that's ministers. And when you put this all together, this looks like a knitting pattern or like a spaghetti diagram. And you see actually what we have done with that. So for example, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, MB, currently serves 19 different ministers because they are responsible for everything. 19 different ministers is more than Ireland has in its entire cabinet. It also means, of course, that effectively MB is not reporting to anyone because there's not a single minister who could actually check on the performance of that bureaucracy. And then what we also do is we really rip portfolios apart where they should be together. Example, if you serve in our armed forces, to the degree we still have armed forces, of course, your minister is Judith Collins because she's the Minister of Defense. If you retire from the armed forces, your minister is Chris Penk because he's responsible for Veterans Affairs. In practically every other country, it's the same minister. Or we talked about housing. We've got a Minister of Housing, and it's Chris Bishop. There it is. Wonderful. If you zoom in, you will have a lot of fun with it. So housing is Chris Bishop. But building and construction, once again, is Chris Penk. And so Chris Penk and Chris Bishop are dealing with very similar issues, and they should actually have something to do with one another. And now if you go up a little bit in that diagram, I'll show you how normal countries look, because this is, of course, New Zealand. If you move this picture up, you can see Norway. And in Norway, how revolutionary is that? You've got one sector of the economy, for example, you take you zoom in here, education, and you've got a Ministry of Education and Research. Then you've got a ministerial portfolio of education, and we've got one actually for research and higher education. And then there are 2 ministers dealing with it. Or health, Ministry of Health. Then there is a ministerial portfolio for health and care services, and there's a minister, Ingrid Kjerkol. And so basically the principle is, in most cases, with very few exceptions, one sector of the country or the economy, with one department dealing with it, with one ministerial portfolio assigned to it, with one minister holding that portfolio, and the responsibilities are clear and the country can be run properly. And in New Zealand, we have these overlapping responsibilities. And once you have seen our spaghetti diagram, I promise you can't unsee it, and it explains a lot of our problems.
When I publish this, I will put some links so people can get a better look. For me, it was a mad scramble to quickly get it into this production studio. But I think it's so indicative of the problems. And I suppose it's really just reinforcing what you're saying, Oliver. I mean, having been in the political system, I found it frustrating because you'd go to see a colleague or a minister and they go, "Oh, no, sorry, Simon, that's not my delegation. Go and see this person." And
exactly. So I'm grateful that David Seymour is finally proposing to tackle that. And to my utter disappointment, a few days later, the Prime Minister was asked what he made of it, and he said, "We're going to keep it exactly the way it is because I don't care. I'm only interested in results, not in organization." I thought, you are not going to get the results if you don't change that organization. So no, on that one, I am totally with David Seymour. I'm so glad we finally have a minister willing to tackle this one, because I know how hard it is, because every party and every minister is so invested in this, because these are all portfolios and these are positions and these are perks that you want to keep. So for a minister to say, okay, let's get rid of this nonsense, let's make it simpler, I think that deserves the greatest respect and support. So I hope that Chris Luxon changes his mind.
I'd hope so. And look, I'm not optimistic. I have no inside knowledge, but all I've seen over the years, and it goes across red and blue, they create new ministries, that's new perks, new responsibilities, very hard to drop that back. And we don't have time to go into, what do they call it, their private secretaries or undersecretaries, a whole new class now. It's just like, oh my Lord.
You know what, I wouldn't actually mind having undersecretaries. I mean, they could be basically studies to ministers and actually could prepare them for a ministerial career. That might be a way to deal with that, but actually splitting all of these responsibilities like that is
it's
just
doing
nuts.
both. That's the problem for New Zealand. I mean, I look at the UK's system, for example, and how they do it. I think it's slightly better. You've got fewer ministers and lots of undersecretaries. Here we do both. We've used to have none, then we had one. Now, I've forgotten exactly how many we've got now. New Zealand just keeps sort of building on and on.
And actually, we had a conversation with the former Prime Minister. I won't say which of them, but you can probably guess. And the response was actually to our diagram, now, of course, it has to change, because the other problem is with every split portfolio, with every split responsibility, you multiply the opportunities for the bureaucracy to slow things down. Because once you've split it between 5 different ministers, you now have 5 different administrative agencies behind them, and they will all try to slow things down, because the public service always likes to keep it the way it is. So once you actually simplify it, you also reduce the power of the bureaucracy. And that was that former Prime Minister's reason for changing it.
And the other one I'd add to it, if you don't mind, is actually it means there's more MPs to actually do what the MPs need to do. In other words, for people listening, anyone who becomes a minister no longer really needs to do select committee work and a lot of the work that the ordinary MP does. So fewer ministers means a few more MPs on select committees, which means we might actually do a slightly better job. Hey, Oliver, I'm exceptionally conscious of your time and actually very grateful that you spent all the time that you have with us across a wide range of topics. As I said at the start, and regardless of where people sit on the political spectrum, the work that you guys lead is thought-provoking. So if they want to find you and your research or the initiative's research, what's the best website to go to?
Very simple, nzinitiative.org.nz. You'll find all our work there. It's all free of charge. You can subscribe to our weekly newsletter, Insights. It's also free. And then we'll keep you updated on our work.
Well, Oliver, firstly, to people, I encourage you to jump on that website, read and engage. And Oliver, look, thank you very much for your time and joining us here today.
Well, thank you, Simon. A pleasure, and I'm happy to do it anytime you like.